Okay, so well, I've tapped Angela on the shoulder. She's going to help me here. We'll ask Angela to just give us a sort of. I think, as you know, we picked up our keynote speaker at the beginning, and it's good to have someone who's coming a bit from outside of Latin American studies. I think to give us a little summary with Adrian as well. So, if Angela and Adrian could possibly give us their grain of salt with regards to final thoughts, and then we'll all pitch in and round things off with the main points that we've taken away from this meeting. And also thinking about where we can go with it, or where we can take this.
So I also had a set of questions. Actually, I think Marilyn's work with Monica Heller actually asked many of these questions back in 1996 and 2001 in Voices of Authority. You know, like, why now? Who wins and loses? How do we hear? Who do we hear? What's needed to build our arguments around social justice, etc. And I'll just go into a few more details with some of those questions. So the question now about languages and languaging and those kind of tensions between the object called language and the processes of meaning making and languaging. Of course, like everything in academia and going back to ancient Greek or whatever is not new. And I was really struck though by Haley's point about reclaiming. And I'm quite interested about why now, why it's timely to reclaim theoretical arguments, you know, really kind of introduced back in the 60s about challenging the idea of a language community versus a speech community, and why now ethnography is trying to deconstruct the superordinate category of languages. You know, why are we kind of why is it so interesting to us now? Because it's been going on for a while, but now it's like really heightened, and we're kind of coming at it. And of course, there's warnings from critical race theory about, you know, post-race and whether post-language is also a whole set of challenges for us. And then I, you know, whose voice do we hear, who gains, who loses. I really also like the idea of lineages of advocacy, of, you know, kind of social justice agendas, and, you know, why, again, now we're asking these questions, what kind of difference we feel that we're going to make as academics through these questions we're asking again. And then throughout, I guess there was a kind of emphasis on giving preference to the marginal and the peripheral, and kind of understanding that the minoritized, that's kind of actively produced, but that we shouldn't kind of be over-romantic about these arguments, that we need to bring criticality to our theorizations, obviously, of kind of celebrating the marginal. And one thing that struck me throughout, actually, and I was quite interested in this as somebody perhaps from, I don't know if I come from a different discipline, I would describe myself as a linguistic anthropologist or a sociolinguist, but I was quite interested in what constituted data throughout the day. Mm-hmm. That felt really quite different for me at times, you know, the kind of the need to present evidence and make arguments around it. The use of photography and photographs in many of the presentations really struck me as well as something not outside of what we would do, but as kind of central to what people do to make their arguments around the image. So that just struck me as something slightly, I suppose, coming together as a different gathering. And then I suppose the last point I would make is I'm quite interested in how these discourses circulate very widely. So it was very interesting the points at the end made about well-being and indigenous groups and indigeneity, because it took me back to Raymond Williams's work, who's a kind of Marxist theorist of English literature, who makes really similar arguments around the peasant and the cosmopolitan, and how they kind of get pushed against, stand up against one another, and then how those kind of get he equates it to a kind of development agenda, and how it kind of gets taken to the cities, and then from the cities, kind of out to other countries, and how it's always made to feel the peasant group is kind of always either over-romanticized or kind of held in a lower status to the cosmopolitan. And I've tried to look at that in terms of the way migrant women speak in this country, the positions they want to take up. So it just kind of struck me, some of the arguments that we've been making today in very, very different contexts, how they are, quite useful to us wherever, what am I trying to say? Even though I'm not obviously researching in Central America, Latin America, these arguments feel quite interesting to me from where I'm coming from as a sociolinguist, looking at language use in Birmingham, Cardiff, London and Leeds. The connections are kind of there. So just some thoughts.
Thanks very much, both of you. Thank you. Well, I'd just like to make a comment or two about this issue of well-being and the two last papers that we heard, because I had put this topic in the list of suggestions in the call for papers, but I hadn't anticipated the response that Kitty and Denise gave me, and sort of rolling back a bit from that. The question in my mind had been, well, there were two actually. One was, I'd been at a meeting on language revitalisation in Warsaw, and it was Lenore Grenoble, I'm pretty sure, who gave a talk about language and well-being. So there's a whole literature I discovered out there in critical social linguistics on this, the relationship between feeling good about the language you speak and your sense of well-being. So there's that. So I had that kind of in my mind. And then the other thing, when I got your paper proposals, what came to my mind was, beyond the abstracts that you presented me, I thought if I were to talk about this topic, I would try to explore the political discourse around sumak kausai or sumak kamanya, as you've been talking about, and find out what they say about language. In fact, as far as I know, they don't say anything about language.
Yeah, that's why it doesn't comment.
Yes, no, and so that is the kind of why. Well, my question for myself would be why, because it seems to me that language and well-being are intimately connected, especially if language is such an embodied phenomenon, as I think we've been agreeing, or at least considering. So that was just a little bit to fill in some of the reasons behind my putting well-being suggestions, and I'm really pleased with the way that your two papers came out of that, because I think it opened up a whole new horizon of what we've been talking about. And then just to go back to your comment about how we're busy deconstructing the superordinate category of languages, it seems to be the case that in the academy this is certainly going on. However, at least in the policy making circles that I've been in touch with in the Andes over the last few years, there isn't any sense of that at all. And on the ground there isn't any sense. In classrooms, in local government offices, in anywhere where people are actually reflecting on language. There's a lot of reflection on language, which I think is a really important, hopefully, first step. But to get to the point where people actually reflect on, well, what is this language? What is this language mixture? What does it mean about? What does it say about who we are? How can we actually make ourselves stronger and feel better about ourselves by embracing that rather than struggling against it? I think that is the big problem, which
there are places like South African universities which are right now ready to implement language policy which is multilingual, and they're using the word translanguaging for language policy development. So you might say, well, that's an academic context, but in a sense it isn't really. In that sense, it's a policy context. And so maybe the conditions have to be right, maybe it has to be the right time and place for something to be implemented. But I think you're right generally, but there are contexts where these messages really are becoming important to policy makers.
That's very good. I mean, that would be something, I actually watched that clip that you have on YouTube in a South African university. And I thought that could be a really useful clip to show to people in Latin America, actually.
Right, okay,
I might try that. Because something I found just recently when I was in Bolivia I was in a conversation with someone in the Ministry of Education about the wording, or the, if you like, the premises of the Constitution with regard to education policy. They've moved on from talking about intercultural bilingual education to talking about intercultural, intracultural, plurilingual education, which you think, wow, this is really getting much more radical and much more, maybe we can do a bit more with this. But then when you look into the text of the education law, it explains what you mean by plurilingual education, because there are many classrooms, especially in the Amazon, where there are many languages being taught. But their idea, or the state's idea of plurilingualism in education is for there to be Spanish taught, that the most appropriate indigenous language of the region taught, plus English.
It's the European model,
that's plurilingual,
isn't it? 2+1,
yeah.
Several monolingualisms side by side.
Yes, but English is the one that makes it pluri.
Yeah.
Not another indigenous or another
and we have heard similar arguments from Colombia.
Exactly.
And Mexico is the case.
Mexico's
Educational
the case as well.
bilingual is obligatory, but it's almost in English, Spanish, and not in an indigenous language.
Yes.
They are not material to learn in indigenous language.
So actually, for them to kind of theorise and design ways of teaching a plurilingual classroom, they're just completely at the starting. I don't even know if they're thinking about it actually. Although I did email this lady I spoke to at the ministry and put it to her that's what they ought to be thinking about. She was very interested. So again,
when I was in Colombia a couple of weeks ago, I heard that this 15-year bilingual Colombia state school policy is going to change towards multilingual in the same kind of direction. Literally, it's happening now. It's something worth watching.
yes.
As I understand it, the British Council had a really big role in Colombia's language education policy, and obviously the British Council comes in with a very political view of English and also a monolingual view, probably. I don't know, maybe that's not fair to the British Council.
And a language industry behind it.
Yeah.
Well, to say something in favour, in support of the British Council, the British Council in Peru gave me money to produce a Quechua, a book with a multimedia DVD for teaching Quechua. They actually funded us to do that.
Very mixed.
So it is mixed.
Yes.
Some projects.
I was
Any
really
institution
surprised that
has
they would
different
fund
social
Quechua.
actors.
So thank you. Can we? Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to take up Adrian's question on what I think is a great way to start the general discussion. So if that sort of the tension that we identify between the idea that language is socially or ideologically constructed, but in some way we're still using not just the word, but we're using it to refer to particular languages. I think the first thing I would want to say is that I don't think every contradiction needs to be resolved. I think we should it's sort of one of our. I think it's also a very Western kind of obsession with having to sort of choose between either or, either it's one thing or the other. And so more generally, we should maybe allow more both ends kind of positions. But I do think that maybe another take on this could be that this dichotomy itself is an artifact of the ontological grounds on which we think about language. So I want to resist a little bit about thinking of language as socially or ideologically constructed, because that assumes that sort of we're still stuck in this multicultural paradigm of there being some sort of the unitary nature idea, and we can carve it up through political processes of this part of speech. So speech being part of the nation, this part because we make the boundary here, we make the boundary here, etc. Which of course then leads to the essentialisms that we've tried to critique. And I think a lot of the trying to counter this kind of the ontological ground on which a lot of our arguments are happening that we're trying to do. It's trying to break away from this dichotomy, also like sort of the dichotomy of sort of constructivist versus essentialist understandings, which I think so. So Spivak, for example, I think she had an interview where she later on where she says, well, the idea of strategic essentialism is I should never have said that. It was one of my worst mistakes. People love to take that up in local contexts. So, oh yeah, we can finally be essentialist as long as it's just for a strategic purpose, right? And so I think and then bringing this, I was then thinking immediately of the work like Janet Chanella's work that I quoted on the Valpes, where you have the idea of language being a corporeal substance. I mean, there's nothing, you can't get more essentialist, right? And do you want to say now, well, oh, they're just mistaken, or this is just a completely wrong take on language, or this is something we should or we should change that. But again, then we're imposing our understanding, our understanding of the nature of language. We're imposing that language is always this, it must, everywhere we encounter it, it must be a sort of construct. And I think that's sort of the thing, that's sort of the position, sort of the default position that I see in a lot of the discussions that I would like to counter. And where I would like to say, like, wait, before we go that way, let's pause a moment and let's like look at what is the larger framework in which practices that we might equivocally translate as language, in what context are these embedded? And so I really loved your kind of the idea of putting like the when we did discussions in here, because I don't think we can like only talk about natures of language without also looking at other things like nature, culture, humanity, what it means to be a person, and sort of the idea of communication between entities. So, yeah, so I think it was I think it was a great sort of combination of issues that
I think that bring that sumac and calcite into the frame was a very... I also thought, Alicia, you had some very interesting material that you were using for your reflection, and if I understood correctly, you had a meeting about religious diversity. Is that correct? The picture you showed us at the end?
Yes, actually, yeah, what I was trying to say is that apparently it was like a meeting about religious diversity with discrete cultures called religions, but the discussion we wanted to promote was about spiritual traditions as ways to convey alternative linguistic ideologies, different linguistic ideologies.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to make a further contribution in terms of final thoughts about what you're taking away and where you think we should be going? Hayley.
I wanted to build on something that Juan de Dios mentioned about the importance of oratory and presentation, which anyone as a pedagogue, we know this is important when we're teaching, but also your question, Rosalind, about how do we take these concepts around language and do things with them, with language policy or education, and to me part of that is how do we as scholars communicate what we know and understand to wider audiences. And this is an area where I think ethnographers often struggle because there's so many details and so much rich complexity in what we have come to know. How do we communicate it? So I just want to say one of the things I'm taking away is that importance of communicating to our audiences, whether it be through artistic formats or continuing to seek other ways of doing that. Georgia mentioned working with radios. There's lots.
Yes, we haven't really talked about radios and television and all that. Anything else?
I think that is very important, this question, because in doing ethnography, in doing field work, we are engaging interactions with the participant, and this kind of interaction, it's a kind of repercussion of our ways to think, our ways to do field work, our objects researches. So it's a first step, but the latest steps, when we publicate, how can we get the way to access this kind of information, the researchers, by the people that don't manage this kind of case words and concept notion, and also how can do that?
Well, I thought that the very first presentation about representation and communicating, using these other sorts of media and modes of, literary modes of discourse, I think was really interesting and somehow ought to be relevant to these questions.
Yeah. What came across to me most strongly with that presentation was it was representation, but it was very different. I mean, it's more like evoking, the difference between evocation and representation, which I talk a bit about in the introduction to a book that I did years ago, an edited volume, Creating Context in Andean Cultures, which you're a part of. And I think it comes from Stuart Hall, with this distinction between evoking culture. Is it Tyler also?
Postmodern I mean, maybe he gets it from somewhere else.
Maybe he does, yeah. I'm not quite sure exactly where the original idea came from, but it's this idea of evocation as sort of living it. In a way, what they did with their data was not to tell us about it, but to do it and to be it and to live it. And that, I just thought it was fantastic. And it did remind me, said to Adrian, it reminded me of Dennis Tedlock's work.
Yes.
Dennis Tedlock is a linguistic anthropology way back, who did a wonderful study of Zuni mythology, storytelling, really, oral storytelling myths, in which he presents his findings by becoming a Zuni and telling his data.
Well, he presents them as
myth.
poetry. So on one hand, he was also part of the Black Mountain School of projective verse.
Okay.
And so he uses a particular kind of poetry that really emphasizes the breath and the use of the breath in the way language is used. And in translation, he tries to carry that over from the Zuni into his English translations by using a kind of dramatic format.
Yeah. Did you ever hear him speak?
Yeah.
I mean, did he actually do a sort of performative thing when he spoke?
Well, he did. I was never convinced that I had. I mean, it was still Dennis. It wasn't a Zuni.
Okay. What a shame.
So he failed then that.
Yeah. But it was very interesting.
Yeah.
He might need more shamanic training.
Yes, I think he didn't quite get there. Are there any other final thoughts, Sheila?
I was also thinking about the first presentation about the trans language.
We've let them leave the room before we start talking about it.
Just I'm involved at the moment. My background's in education, and I'm sort of trying to get away from sort of the formal education in the school. And I'm working at the moment with adult education and a team who are really trying to sort of push back against the formalisation or the lack of adult education or the formalisation of it. So we're working on sort of looking at informal learning, again, moving away from the idea of education to learning. And there seems to be such a potentially strong overlap, so looking at informal contexts for informal learning and the richness of the translanguaging that's going on in informal contexts that will provide insights into the language. Language nature of languages, but also the learning, sort of to link learning in with that kind of research and more sort of work.
Any final thoughts? Well, that can be a final thought. Okay. And I think it's
Over dinner.
yes, over dinner. It's certainly left me with a sense of it's opened up all sorts of vistas and possibilities in my mind, but there's certainly no solution out there, no easy solution to the original question I had in my mind. And So, and also this idea that we can accept contradictions. Maybe we have to learn to live with contradictions, because contradictions are not going to go away. So I take that point. And some of them are very tragic contradictions, I think, as far as this Vivian Bien. It's such an atrocious, sorry to be so outspoken, but I find that it's so atrocious that they have this wonderful idea in their constitution in Ecuador and in Bolivia, and then they're basically trashing nature.
Yeah, I had a point I was going to make about that, because I think these contradictions are sometimes painful, but what's interesting is the people that we're working with, they have to live with these contradictions too. So, and I think this is why I'm interested in this idea. I think we both touched on this, is people living sort of within and between different language ideologies, different ontologies, and actually living well, or the buen vivir, suma causa, that there's something in that as well. So like when my Moroni friends do political activism, they're having to do the nature culture thing. Because how else do you do environmental activism? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it is. I don't think it's just a problem for us. It's actually an interesting problem because it's theirs as well.
But the question is that, just to play the devil's advocate, is it a problem for them? That sort of, I mean, I don't know. We had a conversation over the coffee. Like, you can easily have exactly the same question with language. Like in my context, when they're on the radio or like in public speaking, they're extreme purists and say like, hey, you shouldn't use that word and that. But for them, it's not a problem that they do use that. Of course,
it is a problem if they're not adept in the vocabulary of nature and culture.
Kind of.
That's what I mean.
Oh, sorry.
So it's a major problem if they're not actually adept in that vocabulary. If they don't talk about nature and culture, they might actually lose their lands.
Okay.
That's what I meant.
So, okay, but the contradiction is not necessarily a problem for them.
No, not necessarily.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, they may not be concerned at that level.
Yeah.
They might be concerned of actually having a successful translation.
Or controlling the equivocation.
Yeah.
But it may be a bit like the people in contemporary Huarachiri who, for the purpose of the census, call themselves Quechua, when they have no idea of, they would never define themselves as Quechua, but they take on that that category for political purposes. And this guy, Jose Gualinga, who's now, he's a watcher of the planetary balance and promoter of a new economic development paradigm. He's learned to talk this talk. You just wonder then, is he just talking the talk, or has he absorbed the talk?
You have to subject into
psychoanalysis.
He even links it to development, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Because that's why I've met that.
Okay, well I think it's 10 past, so I think Marilyn wanted to say something.
I just wanted to say thank you for making this happen. It's just the most interesting dialogue, and I've learned a great deal today. I've been on the edge of my seat, just taking it all in. So, and thank you to all the speakers too. It's really fascinating.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to echo that. Thank you to all the speakers for really making this a very special day. I think we've achieved, and it's lived up to my expectations. I've well beyond.